Negative index means the lack of war, the lack of conflict, and the positive index is the one that encompasses structures, institutions that contribute to the creation and the maintenance of peaceful organizations. This also refers to the creation of conditions and the development of capacities. So, we've been talking about this these last few days, the different contributions. The religions can have a very ambivalent role in these international conflicts, but they can also provide major contributions, like how can they de-escalate conflict and transform those, like also untie the knots of violence and war, and to be able to start new processes of international justice initiatives for disarming, like other organizations could do it, and different organizations, like others have been doing. They've been able to provide some support in the generation of conditions for the human development.
It is in this context through which we consider that the document about the fraternity for humanity, this is the fruit of the dialogue of exchanges, of interreligious exchanges and cooperation. This document has been called the Declaration of Abu Dhabi. This, since 2019, it has had multiple implications. And in this sense, I want to make a couple of references. First of all, in interreligious communities, this is a document available to everybody, not only to the Catholic Church and Islam, but other religions. Something that it speaks to Catholic religions and Islamic, and in this course of dialogue, they took both institutions and they signed this document in Abu Dhabi. This was a religious response to the defiance of pluralism, and it created conscious of diversity as something good in religion, rooted in religious liberty. In this sense, religious institutions wanted to reinforce the fact that hostility and extremism was consequences of deviation from religious teachings. And at the same time, they reinforced the need to establish in society what is plentiful citizenship so that everybody can have justice. In this sense, the Abu Dhabi Declaration is considered a critical piece in relations between Catholicism and Islam, and this is also marked by by when Papa Francisco has met with other religious leaders. Within the Catholic tradition, the declaration is also a consequence of interreligious dialogues that started in the Vatican. And this has to do with the relationships between Catholics and believers of other religions, and the Declaration of Unitatis Humanae and religious liberty. On top of this, as we evaluate the importance of the Declaration, this was signed and sealed in a singular occasion, which was the commemoration of the 800 years of the meeting between San Francisco and the Sultan in Egypt during the Fifth Crusade. But we also see the importance and relevance of seeing this accord between Christians and Muslims is not only a historical, but it is also relevant in modern society, since we have seen the church in Jerusalem suffer from some hostilities, but this is something that we created in order to avoid clashes. This document has become an important part of the context between relationships of Catholics, Muslims, and within the politics of the Middle East. And now, to conclude, within the Catholic Church, the document about human fraternity was not just a diplomatic gesture, but it was also a reflection that took place after dialogue. And it also inspired the Pope to write the letter, Encyclica Fratelli Tutti. It was written in the context during the first year of COVID, and in this context of the Third World War that we must escape little by little. The Italian professor Borghesi has called the Fratelli Tutti as the new Passementaris, which is invoking il Passementaris from the Pope from 1993 that was launched during the crisis and the war, the possibility of nuclear war, and the message is still relevant today. Peace is a result of the consolidation of relationships between people, states, and communities, not just the absence of war. Fratelli Tutti develops some of the great themes that are mentioned in the Declaration of Abu Dhabi, and it has its roots in Catholicism and dialogue between people of goodwill. And this has reignited the vision of fraternity. And fraternity was one of the first themes which was mentioned by Papa Francisco from the beginning of his service. And fraternity is the exaltation of the principle of solidarity. And here it is important that we mention that at times when we mention it in context within the church, when we mention fraternity, it can have different connotations depending on what context we are referring to it in. Fraternity can at first be understood as solidarity between people, the relationships of people within a community. It can be manifest in the participation of public discussion within a democratic society. And also when we speak multilateral, we talk fraternity as diplomacy. In this sense, there is an adjective that we must add to this document, that it is human, because fraternity is not a new concept, but the concept of humanity. Papa Francisco wanted to emphasize this feeling with authentic realism, in the sense that the Pope knew that we couldn't be idealistic about abstract universalism, so that we don't fall into cynicism. We must risk extending our hand to ideals, but we must also hope in things that have yet come to pass. In this sense, it implies certain practices and dispositions. We must have courage, which accepts the value of other people's, prayer, which speaks to sincerity. We must also prophesy and speak about justice and in reciprocity, and we must also talk of a future that is full of hope and integrated and cohesive for each human. And this is the last point where we talk about comprehending or developing an understanding within the Catholic Church. And the sixth Pope affirmed that the new name of peace is development. He was mentioning this. It is something that is integral in the development of humanity and for all people. And to conclude, before equality became a principle that was fundamental in the fraternity and solidarity had been lived since the past and in different cultures and beliefs. In Judaism and Christianism and in Islam, fraternity has not been limited to family or the interior of communities. But from these ties, the practices of hospitality were created. There were institutions and centers so that we could take care of the vulnerable. With the French Revolution, the word solidarity was there has been an evolution that has allowed us to allow these ideas to become political ideas and constitutional principles with inspirational ideas from different political movements. The word fraternity was abandoned due to violence to the point of its elimination from the political lexicon. In 2021, 2 years after the Declaration of Abu Dhabi, Papa Francisco expressed, today fraternity is the new frontier of humanity. We are either brothers and sisters or we destroy each other. This is the new frontier, the frontier upon which we must build. This is the challenge of our century. This is the challenge of our times. We are different, but we are brothers and sisters, and we must respect our different cultures, our different citizenships, but we must build this fraternity. And this is the last part, I promise. The mediator, Jean-Paul, In the book, there's a book that states that we must be brave enough to reimagine and reimagine peace. We live in a time where the future can be seen in many different ways, but the Declaration of Abu Dhabi allows us and challenges us not only to think about the challenges we face with technology, but how we can transform our institutions. And it allows us to think about this relational dimension and allow us to develop hope so that together we can formulate politics and reimagine how we can be catalysts for new beginnings at different levels, both locally and internationally. We must create political strategies in order to be able to live one with another in our diversity, but also in the spirit of fraternity. Thank you.
Bueno, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. I would first of all like to say thank you, Gabi, for the invitation, and the Center of Law and Religion and the entire university. It is truly a beautiful stay. We are learning through experience and your style here at the university. I wanted to, in these 10 minutes that I have, I would like to talk about something that I had titled The Contribution of Believers and Religious Leaders to Civil Society, the Mexican case study. During these minutes, I'm going to summarize what has been the last part of a book that I published recently. And the book is called The Civic Concord as the end of the path. At times we start to think about if we live in two different worlds, the internal world of the believers and civil society and secular, you could call it, and public office. And this is true, that they are in the beginning of the path. We find them in the beginning, in the middle, and at the end of the path. And this is something that I have wanted to highlight, it's particularly at the end of the path, so we can put some emphasis on those things that some of the things that we find in common between religious life and civil life, and those things that can be contributed individually towards each of the countries. I don't think I want to have time to summarize what has been the history of Mexico. The title, I have summarized it as the case of Mexico because I have been, for a year and a half, the University of Loyola Andalucía has allowed me to have an extended stay. And I have been in several indigenous communities and in several universities investigating religious conflicts, the restoration of religious conflicts, and a Mayan reform that happened more recently, and the administration of justice and the interaction that exists between the indigenous societies and communities and the constitutional state. This is a topic that is beginning. This is at its infancy because recently the first justice court, the indigenous justice court, was created in Oaxaca, and it has been created in other states. And this is a wonderful way to interconnect all of this justice that they are worthy of, and Otilia reminded of us this yesterday, that is recognized in both internationally and in the United Nations, this right, all of these rights that the indigenous people have, and that we have to recognize not only what they have now, but we must honor those things that they have been awarded with the execution of those rights. I'm going to skip the historical part. The religious presence in Mexico is profound. It is profoundly believing people. The indigenous people were also, before the presence of the Spanish, with the Christianity being introduced, they are a deeply religious people with Catholicism being introduced, they saw in Catholicism that radical life, and it is true that there were simulated conversions, but there were also conversions that were authentic from the heart amongst the indigenous peoples. But the indigenous people have always had a very invisible life, both in the times of the colonies, even though there were laws that were protecting them, and missionaries that when they would see abuse, they would elevate memorials to the king, protesting against these injustices. But it is true that they were cast aside, and they continue to suffer from this even after independence, even though they had a great contribution to the process of Mexican independence, and they continue to have it this whole time during this time of independence. The Constitution basically doesn't mention them, only in the times. It is only from the years, the 70s and 80s, that we begin to see a certain degree of inclusion of the indigenous peoples that we see in the constitutional reform of 2002, and more recently the fourth reformation of the outgoing president and the proposals that the new president of Mexico wants to institute. As a reality of what has been the presence of religion in Mexico, this has been a Catholic presence that has also been linked with the traditions of the Mesoamerican traditions before Christianity, and this has given room to a religiosity that is popular and is manifest in the Virgin Mary, which continues to have a clear presence in all of society, not only in Catholicism, but it is true that during the 19th century we begin to see a movement, almost a penetration of religious leaders, especially those coming from the United States, that came with different Christian denominations. We saw Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, and evangelicals from different branches. And at the beginning, they were minimal. And something very interesting is that almost since the beginning, we started to see missionaries and religious leaders that were coming from the Mexican people, not only from the exterior. This is something that I interpret clearly, precisely as this continuity of religious violence that Mexico has suffered. And I have said that both the indigenous people and also the Mexicans have had a strong vitality, a strong spiritual vitality, and they have always approached those religious movements or those religions that they have seen respond to this anxiety, anxiety of spirituality and religiosity that they have. As a consequence, I must say, first things that came to my mind that while I was doing the investigation of the book I recently published, we have seen that indigenous people have always established and maintained their historic institutions. The tequio, the living of their religions and traditions, the commonality. We see the good of the collective on top of the individual. We see social work that is still tied in with the religion, and this is something that we perhaps see differently in our states where we divide the religion and the state. But something that really comes to my mind and really caught my attention during this investigation is that always, since the beginning, there has been continuous there have been protests from the indigenous people. People tend to think of them as a weak people, but they are not. From the beginning, we have seen continuous. I would say there is not a time during the history of Mexico that we have not seen somewhere some type of fight from the indigenous people towards the governors during those times. And curiously, a great part of these protests were directed and and they were led by leaders that were prophets, charismatic. They were announcing the end of the world or the millennium, or announcing the coming of some of the Mesoamerican gods that were before Christianity, or some reinterpretation of Christianity and the Holy Ghost and Christ and the Virgin Mary. There have always been spiritual connotations, even in their military participation. Life of the indigenous people is not understood without this deeply spiritual life that has affected them in all of their daily living. And there is spirituality that seeks for harmony and good living. This is, if we don't understand this, we won't understand the religious dimension of the indigenous people, because they have a great capacity to assimilate, to integrate. They have added, there are problems that they're trying to solve. They are trying to see if they accept new gods, that they incorporate them. And this is something that they had to implement because they didn't want, they were adopting new ideas, and they didn't want to abandon what they had before. Everything, nowadays, both in Catholic theologies and the evangelical theologies, we are seeing it, this regression of culture. We can't say that we are transmitting faith, but we must consider, without considering the norms and the cultures of the places where we are trying to preach this faith. Given this, now we see a growth of theology, of an Indian theology, both in Catholicism and evangelical groups and different Christian confessions that tend to have compatibility between the divinity of Christ with the traditions, the archaic traditions expressed with the frames or pre-Christian myths. And this is something that is accepted within Catholicism. There is books of scripture that mention the indigenous, different religious, indigenous groups, and liturgy that mentions indigenous peoples. From the 90s, we have seen the presence of Zapatismo. We have seen re-evaluation of values, the pre-Christian values, and also questioning of what has been both Catholic evangelization and military presence of Spain during the 3 centuries. And this has been manifest with the 500-year celebration of the meeting of both worlds, or the evangelization of America, or the conquest of Mexico, or the indigenous resistance. And that you'll call it depending on how you see it. But the reality is that we have seen a great deal of change, and we see that religious leaders in Mexico have to act. We see it among indigenous people. We see that a great number of people are indigenous, and we must have seen these great changes in Chiapas, in Oaxaca, in Guerrero. These are the zones where I have been working. It is true that religious leaders are going through different stages. In the 90s, in the beginnings of the 20th century, in the first 10 years of this century, for me, I learned something negatively. I saw the amount of expulsions of indigenous people that there has been. And we see different numbers between 35,000 and 50,000 people. That is a huge amount. And these were exodus due to religious topics, because they were converts to Christian denominations, and the people that of the majority would outcast them. And we only understand this within a community where we see the decisions that are made by a big party. But we need to start to understand why these situations happen. Because they would say, well, okay, I will convert, but converting to Christianity means that they would no longer participate in the parties. They would no longer participate in ceremonies. They would also not be able to participate in ceremonies where they had to consume alcohol. So they became isolated within their own community because they were no longer participating in what was considered community life. They would say, no, we have converted. It has nothing to do with our community. And I don't have time to explain that. But we must realize that this is a very complex topic. It is not simple. It is not only a matter of religion. There are things that we must mention, including like ancestral hate. And we see a relationship between different peoples. And I must say, there was a law in year 92 that was approved that for the first time gave jurisdictional personality to religions. This was a great this allowed us to receive different laws, and since the year 92 we have seen an increase in the rule of law that allows us to see some rights granted to religious groups. Mexico is a secular state, nobody questions that, but there has been a recent change in which we see the presence of leaders, and we have seen this affect both we have seen this affect things at a local level and at universal level, and we see this at the level of the new president, and we have seen them visit the Pope and the Vatican because this would show the people that they had been blessed by the Pope, and they also would visit other religious leaders. We can see that in Mexico, things are moving. Religious leaders are having a religious prestige that they did not have before, due to persecution or at least the anonymous life that they were supposed to live, and we have seen this change. And all of these conflicts that I have mentioned, that I don't have time to speak of in detail, they have tried to resolve this, both within as we see less education, we see more religious. And we have seen councils, interreligious councils in Mexico in different states. I know many, but I fundamentally know the one of Chiapas because we see the indigenous peoples. The Protestant community is more than 30% of and the indigenous population is also a majority. And one of the activities that I wanted to expose, even though it's very anecdotal, at times in small things, in the micro we find where we can think of big ideas. The macro is not something we can think about now. But we see that all of these different peoples come together to have a Christmas concert for peace, all of the Christian denominations, and it has a great deal of success, and it is very well received. And we have had the pleasure to listen to the choir, which has been beautiful. It's beautiful that there is an interdenominational choir and an interreligious choir. At least in Chiapas, we have seen a great deal of success, and it's true that music and food unites people. If we truly want to resolve conflict, there is nothing better than coming together around the table. We've seen that these days with how well that our brothers and sisters from the church have received us here in Provo. As we gather around a table and we have good conversation, and we gather also around good music. The stomach, our ears, and our mouth, this seems to establish the necessary conditions to resolve conflict. Something we'll see if they are carried out or not, but the conditions are there. So it is I'm very grateful. I'm grateful for your initiative and everything you're doing with these symposiums and with this opportunity that we have to get to know each other. People from so many different places of religions that are so varied, people that come to serve from politics, from civil society and religion, and allowing us to come together to eat well and to listen to music and find a way to start resolving conflict, even if it's a little bit at a time, each one of us giving what we can. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to congratulate with all of you that are providing the church, the community, all this network of support, which is welcome, that is unforgettable. I have new friends here, and I'm leaving this place with a feeling that the Portuguese language intends that it has an untranslatable word that is saudades, missing someone. But I thank for this opportunity to share experiences and at the same time anguishes, and I would like to leave a picture of how in Brazil we are treating this subject that involves dialogue, and we are sure, together with all the international community, with the best expressions of religions, that more talks and more dialogue is necessary. So more talk and not less. And in this sense, I would like to bring the way that I believe is possible to maximize freedoms and the freedom of religious expressions, preserving some fundamental values. And in the title here, we have proselyting, that is a maximization, the possibility of seeking other believers and spread their message, but we have a red sign, a limit in penal right is to establish. It's called to establish. So I have a summary here, and I'd like to start by saying that the term religious racism, our Supreme Court has called the cases of discrimination, hate, speech for a historic reason. They call it religious racism. But our experience shows, well, this is a country that is in its majority Christian, the greatest number of Catholics in the world, but is a country where the father goes down and the pastors are going up. In a very important demographic movement, there is a trend that has been maintained in recent years. In 2032, if those trends remain, evangelicals will be the majority, not more the Catholics. So it's an immense movement and a lot of repercussion in many areas, political, law. Our Constitution consecrates a fundamental right, and the state has to respect the people and the churches. In an objective dimension, there is this difference, lay, state, and there is space for collaboration. And I'm separating a law from 1989 established that the crime of racism and discrimination. And I'd like to highlight two cases from the Supreme Court in Brazil that have been resolved not long ago, and it makes prevail the freedom of religion, and in the other case, and the crime prevails in the other case. So how did the Supreme Court arrive at those conclusions? But we need to go from this case that has been judged. Weingartner was a citizen from Rio Grande do Sul, my state. I am from Porto Alegre. He used to write books that were negationists. It would make apology, anti-Semitic, and the Supreme Court judged that case in 2003 and said that that conduct was anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism was racism. And it was racism because the Supreme Court built a concept that race is a process of political, social content. It's not biological or essential. So every time from this supposition, there was racism and prejudice, segregationalist. It was possible for the penal rights. And the freedom of expression is not an absolute warranty. And there are exceptions in the crimes that have been established, and that should be taken into consideration in the whole of this. But the important here is this concept of racism. And 2019, without a specific law, in Brazil, this is complicated. We have the right, like with civil law, but the Supreme Court understood that homophobism and transphobism also would be a discriminatory racism crime, but there were safeguards that they established, and the freedom of religion was ensured. All spiritual leaders, bishops, fathers, they could say clearly what they understood about that subject, comma, as long as those manifestations, this is a limit of the limit, they would not configurate a hate crime, which is the exteriorization of, it would cause hostilities, violence against people because of their gender identity, etc. We also have a lighter crime of religious injury as a function of religious elements, because we are taking a walk through that. But both cases that I would like to highlight and make comments, the case in 2016, the Supreme Court made prevail the superiority of, proselyting, the possibility of speaking about religion to other people and try to make proselytes is legitimate and is part of the religious expression and freedom. Catholic the priest wrote a book with more than 80 editions, and in that book he said things like, demon is not creative, it's part of the idols of other religions, Umbanda, Candomblé, those religions that came from Africa, that brought a problem of structural racism. The last country to abolish slavery. And so get out of that, get rid of those images. We consider this as a curse, and he was criminally sued because of that, and that incited religious discrimination with a penalty of 1 to 3 years, and because it was religious, from 2 to 5 years. So it's a recent law. The law from 1989, it has had 6 legislative reforms. This is not stabilized throughout the world, actually. If we observe that in Spain it's not that different. In Portugal, the legislator is still with trial and error trying to find a solution that is more fitting to the freedom of speech and the dignity that needs to be ensured too for all people. And if that goes in the context of religious, the penalty will increase if you try to prevent against religious manifestations. The penalty will be increased. This article, it's still in small font, but Article 20C says that to make an interpretation of what discrimination would be, any attitude, treatment, shame, undue exposure that we would not do with other groups. In this case of 2016 of this Monsignore that wrote that book, the Supreme Court stated that religious freedom is a base element of the Constitution and needs to be observed with other rights, but doesn't reach discriminatory conducts. It is especially important in the proselyting speech is essential, so those missionary religions, they need proselyting, and to arrive at that goal, it is possible or reasonable, not illegal, to compare religions between themselves, including explaining the animosity, so it enlarges the speech a lot. So it's interesting here that in the case, like I said, the religious expression prevailed not in what the priest said, using classic text talking about 3 steps of discrimination. Discrimination starts by a statement, a cognitive element: I am wearing a tie. Nobody without a tie. You are not wearing a tie, but so we are different. It's natural, and obviously this is part of our freedom. At a second step, you make a hierarchy. Because I am wearing a tie, I am better, I will be saved, etc. This is also part of the space of freedom of expression. The hate speech will be when, in a third step, because of that difference and hierarchy, I will defend that I have more rights than you, you will have less rights, you cannot stay in the room, you have to leave, etc., etc. That's the structure of the decision of the Supreme Court in relation to this question. So the Supreme recognizes that the conduct of that priest was preponderant, but it's part of what we have to tolerate for the religious freedom can exist, and the state will not be the referee of those questions. And that decision prevailed. That's where the 3 steps of the discourse, the idea that religious pluralism presupposes the existence of a multiplicity of beliefs, and therefore the religious speech, when it's target about the belief of another, to reduce it, actually it means a red light that needs to be stopped by penal right. So I remember that the test of Rabat is proposed by a United Nations document from 2012, is the most promising for this balance. In a recent report about this, 2024, the person that reported, there are 3 possibilities for the hate speech. In fact, in one case, you need to criminalize that. In other instances, there is field for, even if you cause unrest and living together in a generous process of citizenship, this is a great space for education, I'd say, for the best religious expressions, I'd say. Just for you to understand that there was hate speech and there was crime and thesis, the person that was sued, he maintained a blog on the internet that he would preach the end of some churches, discrimination against Jews, and that had extrapolated all limits, and we had clearly hate speech. So I would like to highlight at the end that even with a criminal process, there is a way and space for dialogue and consensus. In Brazil, like in other places, since 2019, there is a possibility for an agreement, so it doesn't continue, and that agreement, like that pledge, the plea in the case of the internet, some youth, the federal justice proposed a plea, and those youth, instead of being condemned and being fulfilling, like doing time, they are preparing materials for the Holocaust Museum. There is a curatory activity, and instead of offenders, they are propagators of tolerance and making things clear. And I'd like to leave this final message about dignity, because we are preserving this. It's like a diamond that we build little by little. It's not something given, but it's something that we cannot negotiate, to protect and promote all people in all places. And this seems that is the subject of all religions. I remember the Punta del Este Declaration in 2018, and there is dignity for all people in all places. I believe this is also a theme for the best religious practices. And I leave Jorge Luis Borges, and he has said that two theologians hated each other, and when they died and went to heaven, they found that they were the same and the only person. Thank you for your attention.